Well, first of all, thanks to you, MIT, President Reif, for inviting me and for putting this symposium on. It's a great pleasure to be on this panel with, I think, really two of the great leaders in the country on this issue, John Podesta and Chair Castor. I'm going to talk about the international side and just a few framing comments to begin with. First of all, 87% of global emissions don't come from the United States. So there's no answer to this problem without working internationally. I would also say that US leadership continues to be enormously important. I mean, when I was in the government, I always found that Madeleine Albright's famous comment that the United States is indispensable with respect to addressing global problems was very much true. Now, the world is not the same as it was in 2016. We've gone through a hard 4 years. Countries are not going to look at us in just the same way, but I will say this, I think countries are going to be very eager to have the US back, somewhat wary for understandable reasons, but eager. And I think it's going to be important for us to approach the rest of the world with a mix of confidence in our own leadership, but also humility. So where does the United States go from here internationally? I think first things first will be to organize and staff the administration the right way with people in key positions, including not just White House and state, but at places like Treasury and the NSC and so forth, people who get climate change, even if it's not their main focus. Climate change needs to be set as a key priority. As John said, Vice President or President-elect Biden has certainly done that so far. There will need to be internal messaging from the president to the White House and the administration about the critical nature of climate change. And I think climate change will need to be made a core part of the national security strategy when that's put out. The national security risks that we face from climate change are huge. They include things like mass migration, failed states, conflict between states, regions becoming uninhabitable, and so forth. So there's just no question that this is going to be a core national security problem, and the president will need to make that clear in the national security strategy. So as people have already said, and as Biden has said frequently, on day one, he will be rejoining Paris. He will announce that. It takes about 30 days to actually happen, but it will happen quickly. The US will need to prepare a new target, a so-called NDC, nationally determined contribution in the lingo, that will be announced by or be part of the climate conference by the end of the year, which will happen in Glasgow. I think that that's a process that will need to be intensive. It should be done carefully. We should not be putting out a new NDC right out of the gate, but we should certainly look to get it done in relatively short order. I would assume somewhere in the range of June or July, but that will be important, and an important sign that the United States is of what the United States is going to actually do, not just talk about doing. Paris, of course, is crucial as a regime, a central point of climate focus for the whole world. It has several elements that are very important in terms of driving ambition, which include the fundamental goals that John has already talked about, well below 2 degrees or best efforts to 1.5. And I entirely agree with John at this point that best efforts goal is now the working goal. Paris includes 5-year individual cycles where countries are supposed to ramp up what they have already pledged to. And that first one comes due in Glasgow at the end of 2021. It is also crucial to understand that Paris doesn't do everything. Paris can't do everything. Paris is built on, and it really only could have been built on, an architecture of nationally determined contributions. The only way you could have gotten all 195 countries to agree. And so national action and buy-in and commitment at the national level is absolutely critical. The core diplomatic mission that we have now going forward is obviously not the one that we had in the Obama administration when we were trying to negotiate the agreement that turned out to be Paris. Now that mission is global decarbonization in the way that John has noted, at speed and at scale. We will need leaders to accept that core mission, which is understood essentially as in the net zero emissions by 2020 context. It will be very hard to achieve this mission, but impossible if we don't have leaders around the world, and particularly in the key countries, who accept that proposition. And if you look at the example, one of the lessons that COVID has to teach, it's that when leaders understand the critical nature of action, the most extraordinary things can happen in the most extraordinarily short periods of time. So that's going to be crucial. And it will also be crucial not just to accept that mid-century strategy out to 2050, but to start now. We can't get there unless people are moving in the 2020s with dispatch. So there is a big opportunity now, and also a big danger presented to us by the COVID and the economic crisis, because the opportunity is, with a green recovery, we can go very far, further than we could have imagined, able to spend more than we would have imagined without it. The danger is, if you don't go green, then you've locked in infrastructure that's high carbon for a long time. Let me talk about some of the things that I think we should be focusing on in particular. We had a body called the Major Economies Forum that President Obama started in his administration, which was the most effective vehicle for climate diplomacy really that we had. It was 17 major developed and developing countries, just a little bit short of the G20. It was, the forerunner of it was actually started by President Bush, and it had great buy-in for the countries that were part of it, very much including China and India for that matter. A new energized and revived MEF process would have some focus on the implementation of Paris, but the core focus would need to be on decarbonization, the global decarbonization that we're all talking about. And I think that organization would need to meet at the leader level. It met at the leader level one time the first year under Obama. After that, other meetings took place at the ministerial level. I think this new MEF ought to meet every other year, at least at the leader level, Sherpa level for other meetings. But it's necessary. You can't drive government action across a government of the sort that we're talking about now, decarbonization action, simply on the backs of environment or climate ministers. The objectives of the MEF would be to get that buy-in for a net zero world in 2050 and the actions that need to be taken on the way there. And I think in appropriate circumstances, there might be specific initiatives that it could launch. It could certainly have people working on key policies and best practices in buildings, power, heavy industry, and so forth, but also specific initiatives might be doable. Things like, for example, sectoral standards for the high carbon global industries like steel, cement, aluminum, chemicals. You could imagine a coalition of both major companies and major countries working to put in place roadmaps that would get us to where we need to be by 2050. You could imagine major initiatives that have to do with not just stopping new coal, which we absolutely have to do. We also have to retire coal much, much faster than ordinary retirement schedules would assume. We will need to pursue a broad diplomacy beyond the MEF, and there are a number of players who will be crucial in doing that in order to drive us toward our goals. I think there will be no partner more important than the EU. The EU right now is way out in front of everybody else, really. They have a net zero pledge to 2050. They have a 55% reduction pledge by 2030. They have put in place what they call a European Green Deal, which is not just to have these long-term pledges, but to put in place operational regulatory changes that will get the EU there step by step. And what they are including, by the way, 150 billion euro plan to provide for essentially a just transition. To assist those who are most vulnerable to the green transition, which I think is again going to be crucial in this country. We will need to work closely with allies like Canada, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, hopefully other developed country partners besides the EU that we've always been close with. I think no entity is going to be more important than China, and it's going to be crucial and also highly challenging. We had a very important partnership or collaborative arrangement with China during the Obama years. Always very difficult, but very important and productive. China represents 27% of global emissions, and without China engaged, we can't get there. But it is also true that the overall relationship between the United States and China has deteriorated significantly, and it will complicate our efforts to recreate a climate partnership. And this is not just about Trump. There's a high level of concern about Chinese conduct, I think, really across the political spectrum, from Democrats to Republicans, for a whole range of behaviors that we're all familiar with. I think very much unlike the Trump team, I don't think that the Biden team will look at China as a matter of existential conflict, as a matter of saying that given the Chinese Communist Party, we can't deal with them. That's not going to be the approach from the Biden side, but it will be important, and they will certainly be looking, I think, to be able to get the right mix of competition and, where possible, collaboration, particularly on global issues like climate change. The other thing that will be crucial for our capacity to work effectively with China is that both countries are committed to ramping up at the level and at the scale that's necessary. We know that on our side. We know where Biden is. Xi Jinping's statement that John alluded to at the UN in September, I think, was enormously encouraging, quite important. It said that China was committed to carbon neutrality before 2060. That, you know, was as close as we could get to 2051 would be good. But the thing that's actually more important is that China's shorter-term conduct, its plans for the 2020s, are by no means clear yet. And there have been some soundings coming out of China that are not so encouraging on this front, that suggest that China might be looking essentially at a flat line for emissions during this decade, which would not at all be useful. And they've also got in the planning process 100 gigawatts of new coal in China and another 100 gigawatts of new coal on their Belt and Road Initiative. None of those things is consistent with staying within a carbon budget that we need for 1.5 degrees. So I don't. It's not. We don't know yet where China's going to go in the short run. The most important next signal, I suppose, will be. Well, maybe two things. There will be the Glasgow meeting coming up to see whether they enhance their target for 2030, and then maybe even more important, the 5-year plan the 14th 5-year plan that's supposed to come out roughly in March. But all of that's going to be critical. We will also need to work closely with important other emerging players, market players like India. Brazil is going to be its own problem because it's got Bolsonaro is essentially a kind of Trumpist president, and the threat that he poses to the Amazon is just absolutely crucial. We are not that far from the Amazon going into an irreversible period of decline and moving toward a savanna rather than being a forest, which would be fairly catastrophic. The other thing I think is going to be very important is that we work, and probably with the EU, in reanimating the group of progressives that were key players in the Paris negotiations. They came to be called the High Ambition Coalition during the Paris talks, but again, I think very important with respect to putting pressure on important players, including China, And I think it will be also crucial that we work hard with the EU and others to greatly ramp up the level of international financial investment in poorer and more vulnerable developing countries. If we're going to have those countries on our side with respect to driving the kind of change we need, it's going to be important for them to not be for it not to be the case that the only big time investor in those countries is China. John, I have a feeling I'm going. Am I at the point where I should stop here in terms of time?
You got another couple of minutes if you want.
Okay. All right, I'll run quickly then in another couple of minutes. On finance, let me just say a couple of quick things. It is imperative to drive more clean energy investment. As I just said, historically, the UN climate body's focus has always just been on essentially government grants from developed countries to developing. That's a small percentage of what really needs to happen. There are tools that have always been there that we've used in places like our development finance institution used to be called OPIC, it's now U.S. Development Finance Corporation. Things like loan guarantees, political risk insurance, tools like that can help drive finance to poorer countries. Their own action to build their enabling environments is absolutely critical when you make regulatory changes. Countries that you wouldn't necessarily expect, Nicaragua, Morocco, the Philippines, have drawn in large amounts of international investment because they've done the right thing in terms of regulation. Private capital always follows the basic risk reward calculations. So you're not going to be able to pull in money unless you make it attractive. But there's also a much more intensive focus now, and I think that's going to continue to aligning broader international financial flows with climate change coming out of places like the World Bank and the multilateral development banks, and including the IMF. The multilateral development bank financing has gone from 25 billion to 61 billion in just the last 3 or 4 years. And the IMF is thinking very seriously about the kinds of steps that it can take. It has classified climate change as a macro critical risk, which is important, and they're thinking through all that will imply for countries' management of their own economies. And they are also looking very seriously at what can be done with the indebtedness problem, which is particularly striking in sub-Saharan Africa. If we want to be able to get concessional lending for climate purposes, for green purposes to countries like that, they've got to be able to not be cut off by debt limits. A few other things which I won't go into detail on. Fossil fuel subsidies are atrocious. I mean, it's $500 billion in direct funding, and by the IMF's own methodology, which is indirect, some $5 trillion. It's crazy, obviously, that kind of funding goes for that purpose, and very little of it, by the way, goes for poor people. Trade adjustment, border adjustment measures are something that the EU is looking at very closely. We will need to look at that closely too. Those are measures that can get applied to the exports of countries that are not doing enough. I think that could be very important, and the kind of risk disclosure measures that Mark Carney first got going at the Bank of England, the task force on climate-related disclosure, the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. Very good report, much in the right direction. Those things need to be made mandatory in order for them to have any powers. Let me stop there, John.